Welcome back to episode number 11 of Mr. Hayden's Ag Lessons. Today we're going to take an in-depth look at weeds. And I am your host, Mr. Hayden. Welcome back on this beautiful Tuesday. Pretty nice weather out today in Independence in Northeast Iowa. But as you notice, there's those sump pump sponsor of the day. We're starting with Dunlap Motors. Buy and drive the car of your dreams and only pay for it over the next 6 years. But if you notice when you drive or when you're living in Independence, if you notice in your yard or in fields, everything's starting to get a little green. The plants that you want to get green, but also the plants that you might not want to as much. So when we're talking about plants today, we're talking about weeds. And when we're talking about weeds, it can be anything from plants that damage a crop field for farmers, but also we're going to talk about weeds that might impact your yard. So first off, a weed defined as just a plant that's out of place. So a corn plant in a bean field would be considered a weed. We could also see in our yard, a dandelion would be considered a weed. A lot of our grasses that we have growing in Iowa here in terms of our yard are cool season grasses like Kentucky bluegrass, but a different grass species would be considered a weed. And so one of the main ways that weeds cause damage in our agronomic and our fields like corn and soybeans is they steal nutrients from the intended crop. They also steal sunlight. They can outcompete the plant. If they germinate quicker than the intended plant, they can take over in a hurry. If you're familiar with feeding forages to different animals, some weeds have very prickly leaves and they can damage the quality of forages. And then finally, some weed seeds are so similar to the intended crop seed that they can actually damage the seed that we plant from year to year. So we don't want to plant intended crop seed that actually has weed seed present in it. Okay, and then so when we think about how weeds, when they reproduce, they have different ways of reproducing. Some weeds, they produce a ton of individual seeds, while some other weeds, they can actually produce by the root system growing like a Canadian thistle underground and separating to propagate other plants. But when we looked at those damaged by weeds, some of the most troublesome weeds in Iowa that we're aware of are, we have our water hemp, we have common ragweed, we have velvet leaf, foxtail, and you could say lamb's quarter, pigweed. Those are all different weeds that farmers spend a lot of time and money trying to prevent in their fields, okay? And one of the main ways that we try to control weeds is in the springtime. Some of those weeds will be very quick to germinate, more even quicker than what we are trying to plant our intended crop. And so a lot of times mechanical tillage will happen, such as field cultivating, where we disturb the soil right before planting. And what happens there is we bury the weeds that are just starting to sprout and relatively just killing them. But when we turn up that soil, it also allows the weed seed bank that's present in the soil, meaning there could be thousands of weed seeds that are in the soil just waiting for their chance to grow. And so when we tear up the soil, we prepare the seed bed, but we also spark germination for a lot of their seeds, okay? So one other method that a farmer might use is they might use some type of herbicide, okay? And a herbicide has different forms. We're going to talk about control methods, and that might be example of a pre-plant herbicide that's usually going to be non-selective. And what I mean by that, a herbicide that it kills all plant material in that area. It doesn't matter if it's a grass or a broadleaf weed. That's an example there. We're also going to try a pre-emergent herbicide, which means that before we've planted our crop, our corn or soybeans, but they have not germinated yet, and the herbicide that we spray, it kills all weeds that are sprayed in the application. So one of the ways is if the herbicide that's sprayed on the leaves can actually be absorbed through the plant, carried down into the root system, and kill that plant completely. You might think that perennial weeds, ones that come back year after year, are the most troublesome, but in a lot of cases, our annual weeds are actually the more troublesome weed species, mainly due to the fact to their extremely prolific production. So an example in water hemp is a water hemp plant. It can produce 250,000 seeds in one growing season. And since it's an annual, it does die at the end of the year. The other thing we've seen is that water hemp is also a plant that is developing some resistance to glyphosate, which is our trade name for Roundup, or I should say the chemical name for Roundup. And so we have to be aware of, as nature, as weeds take their ability to mutate slightly and to become resistant, we have to find new methods of control. And that might be something as simple as having a different formula in terms of a chemical to use, or not depending on one chemical all at the same time. And when we use things like glyphosate, we have to make sure that our intended crop is resistant to that chemical. and that involves altering the genetic makeup of that plant to help that plant survive that spraying, okay? And so I did talk a little about water hemp a little bit there, but we also have a lot of different grasses, and those grasses, they have a fibrous root system. They take up a lot of nutrients. They can grow in the row, in between the rows of crops. Before herbicides were popular in the 1960s, 1950s, the primary weed control was mechanical, disturbing the soil. Row cultivators, we don't really see much of those unless you're in organic type production. And so as we move to herbicides, there's fewer passes in the field. The only thing that it does require is the right soil moisture, meaning that we can't drive through a field when it's extremely wet. Weed control is all about timing, meaning you need to be able to spray the weeds or spray the field at the appropriate time that's going to maximize the control of that weed, okay? And so when we think about those types of damage there, we don't want a lot of weeds to compete with the crop, because if it's more expensive to compete with the crop or more expensive to produce the crop, that means more expensive food prices for you at the grocery store, okay? That is our second Sump Pump sponsor of the day. We're talking about Joe's Pizza, flour from Italy, which makes the best pizza in Indy. Okay, and then all weeds, like we said, they do have their ability to produce large amounts of seed, and also their growth habits, how they can sprout earlier than others, can make them very difficult to control. And I did talk a little bit about selective and non-selective weed control. A selective weed control is what you're going to use to kill a certain type or family or group of weeds. There are many different types of herbicides we use in production agriculture. And one thing to keep in mind is when we are talking about herbicides, the active ingredient, like with Roundup, over an entire acre of crop ground, you might only spray maybe about 12 ounces of actual Roundup. The rest of it is diluted into water. So the actual active ingredient that is sprayed over an entire acre, which is about the size of a football field, is actually extremely low. And so just for your own knowledge there, when we're talking about herbicides and how we use them in agriculture. But when we shift to your yard, which I know a lot of you are excited, you're getting out the mower, you're ready to get that yard mowed and making it look nice and fresh and clean. Some of the best weed control is weed prevention. We've all heard an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that definitely holds true when we're talking about your yard. So this spring, right now, one of the two, or I should say two of the most damaging crops, you could say, or I should say weeds in your yard, might be dandelions and crabgrass. And a lot of you have familiarity with those two weeds. We want to make sure our yard is a little different than a crop field, because we want it to look aesthetically pleasing to the eye. We're not so concerned about a yield, but we do want a nice, beautiful, thick, green, rich yard that is not full of weeds, whether that makes it difficult. If you just step on a thistle in your yard, that doesn't make it pleasant, or if you see dandelions blooming all over the place there. So we're going to talk about dandelions first. Dandelions are especially hard to control because they are a perennial weed. They come back year after year. They have a single taproot that goes about 6 to 18 inches into the soil. The other problem with dandelions is they have the ability to produce about 15,000 seeds per year. And so we've seen a dandelion that shoots its stem up and produces a flower and then the seed. It can get carried very far. And dandelion seed can travel up to 5 miles based on wind and other factors there. So the other thing that makes dandelions very difficult to control is their growth habit. The leaves, they grow horizontally, which when we mow our yard, those leaves mainly survive. The horizontal growth close to the ground, it is below the cutting height of our grass. And then after you do go through and cut your yard, it seems like you get that just pop-up of immense dandelions that are getting ready to flower, and then those seeds are being carried everywhere. And like I said, our dandelions there, you're going to want to use a selective herbicide. You have to be extremely careful with your yard. Do not use a non-selective herbicide. A non-selective herbicide will kill all plant material in your yard. So there's specific herbicides that will kill dandelions. You can also, there's, I think, granular types that will prevent the germination of dandelions and also control the ones that are also there. Crabgrass is another type of weed that is very common in your yard. Same thing there, horizontal growth habit. With our crabgrass there, it also is very, very prolific. It can produce 150,000 seeds during the growing season. And so crabgrass is part of the grass family, so it is the same family as like our Kentucky bluegrass. So the type of herbicide you use is very important when you're trying to control crabgrass. And the best way there is to use some type of pre-emergence herbicide there that's going to prevent the crabgrass from even growing in the first place. Once it gets going, it takes a lot of different methods of control which allow it to control that. So we did a really quick rundown today of weeds. I know there wasn't a whole lot of content there. Please, in the comments, help me out by recommending some future topics for Mr. Hayden Ag Lessons. And I hope you're looking forward to getting outside in your yard and during the social distancing. One of our other sponsors I wanted to touch on here as we're getting into the month of April, Bauer's Discount Store. Bauer's, always lowest prices for items you didn't even know you needed in the first place. So with that, I'm going to leave you on this Tuesday evening with episode 11, and hopefully thank you for viewing, and we'll see you tomorrow night for episode 12.